There is a particular kind of silence that lives on the water, not the silence of peace, not the silence of rest. It is the silence of something forgotten, a held breath that never gets released, a stillness that presses against the chest until breathing itself feels like an act of defiance. Marcus Hale knew that silence better than he knew most people. He had learned it young, somewhere between his third deployment and the moment he stopped being able to sleep in rooms with ceilings. He was 41 years old, and he was sitting on a piece of cardboard outside a gas station in Gulfport, Mississippi, watching the October sky turn the color of old copper. A paper cup sat between his knees, not for begging. He had drawn a hard line at that years ago, but because someone had set it there without asking, and he didn't have the energy to move it. His boots were military issue, resoled twice. His jacket was gray, once dark green. His face was the kind of weathered that had nothing to do with weather. Beside him, pressed warm and heavy against his right thigh, was the dog. Her name was Rook. She was a Belgian Malinois, almost 7 years old, with a scar that ran from her left shoulder to the base of her neck. She had earned that scar the same night Marcus had earned the one on his forearm, a night in a country neither of them was supposed to have been in, doing a thing that would never appear in any official record. They had carried each other home, in every way that mattered. Rook did not sit the way other dogs sat. She sat the way soldiers stand, upright, aware, eyes moving slowly across the parking lot, cataloging every person, every car, every shift in wind. When Marcus was sleeping, she did not sleep. When he was awake, she pressed close enough that he could feel her heartbeat. Some nights, that was the only thing that kept his own heart remembering its rhythm. He had not always been here. There had been 16 years. 16 years of being something singular, something forged. A man who could hold his breath for 4 minutes underwater, who could navigate by stars on moonless nights, who had once spent 11 days alone in a jungle with a broken radio and a dislocated shoulder, and had walked out with 3 other men who were all still alive. He had been a Navy SEAL at a time when that word still meant something so specific and so demanding that most people could not even frame a complete sentence around it. He had served with men he would have died for. He had served in places he could not name. He had done things that, when he let himself think about them too long, made the inside of his head feel like a room with no doors. He left the service at 36, quietly, the way most good soldiers leave, not with ceremony, but with a handshake and a folder of paperwork that felt profoundly inadequate. He had a commendation. He had a scar. He had Rook, who had been retired from service the same week he was. He had a rucksack. He had a sister in Biloxi, who had called him every Sunday for 8 months before she stopped, not out of cruelty, but out of exhaustion. Because he never answered, and she had her own life to hold together. He had tried the transition programs, the support groups where men sat in circles and described the same dreams in slightly different words. He had tried the apartment in Pensacola, the construction job, the bartending position at a quiet place on the bay. None of it held. The walls were always too close. The noise was always either too much or too absent. He had not been built for the ordinary world, and the ordinary world, for its part, had not particularly tried to make room for him. So here he was. 41, sitting on cardboard watching copper sky, and then the letter came. It arrived through his sister, forwarded 3 times across 6 months, finally reaching him through a social worker at a veterans shelter who had tracked him down with the kind of gentle, persistent patience that deserved more recognition than it ever got. The envelope was cream-colored, heavy stock, from an attorney's office in Charleston, South Carolina. Marcus held it for a long time before opening it. He turned it over in his hands the way a man turns over a stone. He isn't sure he wants to look under. His great uncle, Bernard Hale, a man Marcus had met exactly twice, once as a child at a funeral, once as a teenager at some dim family gathering where no one had spoken directly to each other, had died at 83. He had left behind no children, no spouse, no debts of consequence. What he had left behind was an island, 17 acres off the coast of South Carolina. Salt marsh on two sides, pine scrub on the interior, no road access, no power grid, no freshwater well that anyone knew of. The surveyor's note attached to the deed called it, with bureaucratic bluntness, of negligible development value. The attorney's cover letter was careful and neutral, but Marcus, who had spent 16 years learning to read the things people tried not to say, could feel the politely concealed bewilderment radiating from every paragraph. He showed the letter to Rook. She sniffed it once, then looked back at the parking lot. He took a bus to Charleston. The attorney's name was Graham Pelton. He was 45, silver at the temples, with the smooth, slightly rehearsed manner of a man who spent his life managing other people's awkwardness. His office was on the third floor of a building that smelled like carpet cleaner and old ambition. When Marcus walked in, a rucksack over one shoulder, Rook at his heel, the young receptionist stiffened, and Graham Pelton, when he appeared, did the thing that Marcus had long since stopped being surprised by. He looked, he assessed. He composed his face into something professional and neutral, but not before Marcus had already seen the flicker. The meeting was brief and informational. The island was called Pelican Flat on old charts, though no one seemed to use that name anymore. There were 3 other parties who had submitted informal inquiries about the property, developers, Graham mentioned with careful vagueness, but the deed was clean, the inheritance uncontested. It was Marcus's. All 17 acres of salt marsh and scrub pine, and as Graham put it with a slight clearing of his throat, whatever may be on it. When Marcus asked what that meant, Graham said simply that the island had not been surveyed properly in over 40 years, and that the old survey maps were not entirely reliable. Marcus signed the papers. Outside the building, on the sidewalk, he sat down on the front steps because his legs had decided they needed a moment. Rook pressed against him. He looked at the deed, just a sheet of paper, really just words and a stamp, and felt something move through him that he had no clean name for. Not joy, not relief. Something older and quieter than either of those things. Something that felt like a door opening in a house he had forgotten he owned. 2 men in expensive clothes came down the steps behind him, having apparently just left the same building. They stopped, not because they needed to, but because Marcus was sitting on the steps, and they chose not to simply walk around. One of them, tan, gold watch, the kind of casual wealth that never looks accidental, looked at the deed in Marcus's hand, then at Marcus himself, then at Rook. Something shifted in his expression. "That the Pelican Flat property," the man said, not asked, said. Marcus looked up slowly. "Yes." The man exchanged a glance with his companion that was supposed to be subtle and was not. "Good luck with that," he said, and there was laughter in his voice even though his mouth didn't move into a full smile. "Nothing out there but marsh, gas, and sand." Marcus said nothing. He simply looked at the man with the particular quality of stillness that men who have been genuinely dangerous for extended periods of their lives sometimes develop. Not a threat, not a performance. Just a complete and utter absence of the anxiety most people carry in their faces. The man's smile flickered. He walked away. Rook watched him go. A fisherman named Ellis took them out to the island for $40, and the taciturn understanding that he would come back in 3 days. The boat was a flat-bottomed aluminum thing that smelled of bait and old rain. The water was gray-green, stippled with chop, and the morning was cold in the specific way that coastal mornings in October are cold, not brutal, but insistent. A cold that gets into the seams of things. The island emerged from the mist slowly, the way all meaningful things tend to appear, not with announcement, but with gradual inevitability. Low pine trees, dark and dense. A narrow beach of hard sand and shell. Marsh grass on the southern edge, moving in the wind like something breathing. No dock, no structure that Marcus could see from the water. Nothing. Ellis cut the engine and let the bow slide up onto the sand. He looked at the island, then at Marcus, with the careful neutrality of a man who has learned not to voice opinions about other people's choices. 3 days, Marcus said. Ellis nodded and pushed off. Marcus stood on the beach with his rucksack and rook, and he listened. Wind through pine, the distant sound of a turn. The soft mechanical rhythm of small waves against sand. He breathed in and tasted salt and vegetation, and the faint, iron-edged smell of the marsh. Rook stood at the waterline, head slightly raised, nostrils working. Then she began to move, not the casual, exploratory movement of a dog investigating new terrain, something deliberate, something specific. She moved off the beach and into the scrub with a low, focused energy that Marcus recognized immediately, because he had seen it before, on a hillside in eastern Syria. In a tunnel complex in the dark, in a village square on a windless afternoon. It was the energy of purpose, of having found the thread of something. He followed her. The interior of the island was dense and tangled, not impenetrable but resistant, the kind of growth that happens when nothing has been cleared or managed in a very long time. Palmetto scrub, young pine, patches of sawgrass, ground soft underfoot with the accumulated decomposition of decades. Marcus moved through it quietly, the old muscle memory surfacing without being called, the way it always did in terrain. Rook stopped. She was in a low clearing near the center of the island, a slightly flattened area where the trees thinned and the ground had a different quality, harder, more compacted, less overgrown. She was standing over a patch of earth near the base of a large pine, and she was doing the thing she had been trained to do, not digging, standing, still, rigid, one paw slightly raised. Marcus crouched down beside her. He looked at the ground, he looked at the tree. He looked at the way the roots of the tree had grown around something, a shape, a regularity that nature does not typically produce. A corner, a straight line, he started to clear. With his hands first, then with a flat piece of driftwood he found nearby, working methodically. The way he had been trained to work, careful, patient, not rushing the reveal. He had learned long ago that rushing a reveal was how you missed something, or broke something, or lost the context of what you were finding. It took 40 minutes. What emerged from beneath the root system and the decades of accumulated soil and leaf matter was a metal container. Military specification, waterproof, olive drab, with a locking mechanism that had corroded but not completely seized. And beside it, partially exposed by the same root system, a second container, and 3 feet further the unmistakable edge of a third. Marcus sat back on his heels. He felt the pulse in his throat. He looked at Rook, who looked back at him with the calm, matter-of-fact expression of a dog who has done exactly what she was supposed to do, and is now waiting for appropriate acknowledgement. He opened the first container. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth that had done its job with remarkable fidelity, were documents. Real documents, survey records, geological assessments, correspondence between what appeared to be a private development company and 2 county officials dated between 1987 and 1993. Marcus read slowly, his finger moving across lines, his mind doing the work of assembly. The island was not worthless, had never been worthless. Beneath the marsh on the southern edge of Pelican Flat lay a deposit of something that the geological assessments described in the restrained technical language of professional certainty as significant. The word they kept returning to was phosphate, an enormous, accessible deposit of phosphate that, by any reasonable market assessment, would have been worth several $1 million in the 1990s, and considerably more now. The documents laid out a plan, systematic, deliberate, and cold, to suppress the surveys, allow the island to pass through Bernard Hale's hands as worthless inherited property, wait for him to sell it cheap or leave it to decay, and then acquire it quietly through a series of intermediary purchases. Bernard Hale had known. The correspondence included one letter in his handwriting, careful, old-fashioned cursive, in which he told the development company, in language that was polite and immovable, that he was not interested, that he knew what they were doing, and that the island would stay in the family. He had buried the evidence himself. He had buried it and let the roots grow over it and said nothing to anyone. Waiting, Marcus understood this with a certainty that settled in his chest like a stone, waiting for the right person to find it. The second container held maps, detailed, hand-annotated maps of the deposit's extent, drawn by Bernard Hale himself over what must have been years of patient, private observation. The third container held a letter, just one, addressed in that same careful cursive to Marcus Hale by name. Marcus's hands were not shaking. He had been in situations of genuine extremity enough times to know that the body, when it is truly confronted with something enormous, does not always respond with trembling. Sometimes it simply becomes very still, very quiet, very present. He read the letter. Bernard Hale had been watching. Not closely, not intrusively, but in the way of a man who takes quiet notice of the people in his bloodline, who they are, what they carry, what they're made of. He had followed Marcus's service career through the fragments that filtered into public record. He had known, with the particular intuition of a man who had served his own time in the Navy 50 years earlier, what those fragments meant, what kind of person they described. "I knew you'd bring the dog," the letter said near the end. "I heard about her, and I knew she'd find it. I didn't know when, but I knew. Don't let them have it. That's all I'm asking. Not because of the money, because they think people like us don't notice, because they think people like us can be moved around and around until there's nothing left. You know how to hold ground, Marcus. Hold this one." Marcus read the letter twice. Then he folded it carefully and placed it inside his jacket against his chest. He sat in the clearing with the pine trees moving overhead and Rook beside him, her warm weight against his knee. And he did not cry, not because he was suppressing anything, but because what he felt was too large and too quiet for tears. It was the feeling of being known by someone who was already gone, of having been chosen not for what you had or what you could offer, but for what you fundamentally were. He thought about the man on the steps with the gold watch, the politely concealed laughter, the look that passed between two people who had decided, on the basis of a rucksack and a worn jacket and a cardboard square, that they understood the entire shape of a man's worth. He thought about 16 years of carrying things in silence, about Rook's scar, about the particular loneliness of being excellent at something the world only values in moments of crisis and then prefers to forget. He sat with all of it. Then he stood up. The legal process took 14 months. Marcus did not do it alone. He had the documents, which were substantial, and he had the testimony of a forensic accountant and a geological firm. And he had an attorney in Charleston, who took the case with a quiet fervor that suggested she had been waiting for exactly this kind of fight. 2 of the county officials named in the correspondence had died. One was still alive, retired, living in a house in Beaufort. The development company had changed names 3 times, but not its fundamental nature. The case never went a full trial. The settlement, reached on a gray Tuesday morning in a conference room that smelled of coffee and legal weight, included a public acknowledgement of document suppression and a number that Marcus, who had once had nothing, processed in absolute silence for a long moment before signing. He did not sell the island. He built a small structure on the cleared land near the center. Not a house, exactly, more of a durable shelter, wood and corrugated metal. Enough for a man and a dog, and the equipment needed to manage a piece of land with intention. He hired 2 veterans from the shelter network to help maintain it. He established a foundation with a name that meant nothing to anyone who didn't know the story and everything to anyone who did. He kept the deposit rights, but negotiated extraction terms that were controlled and minimal, enough to fund the work without surrendering the land to the thing it had always been targeted to become. He sat on the beach on winter mornings and drank coffee and watched the water. Rook sat beside him, warm and present and fully herself, her amber eyes moving across the marsh grass with the quiet, ceaseless vigilance of a creature who has never once in her life confused stillness with safety. She was older now, a gray beginning to appear around her muzzle and sometimes her shoulder, the scarred one, was stiff in cold weather. Marcus noticed. He always noticed. He adjusted her portion of the morning walk. He kept a blanket near her spot in the shelter. He understood, without sentimentality but with complete clarity, that she had given him more than any document or deed could quantify. She had given him a reason to keep moving forward on nights when forward was not an obvious direction. Some things cannot be inherited. Some things can only be found by the ones patient enough and steady enough and present enough to follow the thread all the way to the source. Bernard Hale had known that. He had understood something about the nature of worth that the men with gold watches and development portfolios had entirely missed. Worth is not assessed from a sidewalk glance. It is not measured in the cleanliness of a jacket or the address on a mailing envelope. It accumulates in silence, in endurance, in the long and unglamorous commitment to remaining oneself when the world has organized itself around the premise that you no longer exist. Marcus Hale had been invisible to the people who thought visibility was something they assigned. He had never been invisible to the ground beneath his feet, or the dog beside him, or the graytuncle who had buried a letter in the roots of a pine tree and waited, patiently, across time, for the right pair of hands to clear the earth away. The water moved the way it always moved, without opinion, without urgency. Consistent in its depth and its direction, and its absolute indifference to the smallness of the things that tried to claim ownership over it. Rook pressed her head against Marcus's knee. He put his hand on her, and the morning opened around them, and it was enough. It was, in the end, more than enough.